Great, thank you. Can y'all hear me all right? If I get to where I'm cutting out, just say, hey, I can't hear you, and I'll try and shout a little louder. This is a great throwback for me. When I started my career up in Wisconsin, we did almost all of our meetings in a stockyard because we didn't have big places to have them. So it's great for me to be back in a climate that I'm used to. So anyways, we're going to get going through a lot of things, and really what we want to try and lay some groundwork on is trying to think about the process of renovation from an economic standpoint. And Dr. Roberts went through a lot of the things already that we'll talk about, but just remember the profitability formula that we refer to a lot of times. It is not gross income equals profit. You have to take out your cost as well. And so when we start thinking about that from a cow-calf standpoint, a lot of the things that we're looking at is our total weaning weight times the price that we're going to get, and then also the salvage value of any cull cows or bulls that we might be marketing in that given year times the price that we receive for those. And thank goodness the cull cow market's bounced back up a little bit compared to last fall. But then we've got to take our costs out of that as well, right? To really get down at this profitability formula. And there are a lot of factors that can manage or influence those, particularly things that we can manage. If we think about weaning weights, fall calving herds, what is one management tool that you all might do to increase weaning weight on fall-born calves? Creep feeding, exactly. So that's a management tool. And so there are a lot of things that fit into this. When we talk to our kids that are coming through beef production, we try to have them think about this interrelated circle approach. It's a system approach. A lot of times we really get focused down one area, you know. All right, I did protein nutrition for feedlot cattle, so that was my PhD work, and by golly, I knew a lot about protein needs for cattle and how to build diets in the feed yard. But that's just one specific thing. You know, we may have to step back and say, well, the best gain ration may not be the most profitable ration because the feed cost is too high. And so when we start thinking about this approach as where you've got human resource management and you've got this integrated resource management approach that takes into fact all the farm management aspects, it begins to give you a little bit more of a challenge when you start thinking about making decisions, but it's a more holistic approach. So that's what we want you to start kind of to maybe think about, and we can pull one segment out of that. We can pull the cattle enterprise out of that and then look at the potential circles within that cattle enterprise that are influenced by different things. Let's say you have a fixed amount of income and you've got $5,000 of disposable cash that you had to be able to make an investment in. You need to make a decision based on that. Do I improve the reproduction rates by maybe doing what Dr. Anderson is working with a lot of farmers, Tommy and Brandon have got several herds in, looking at trying to synchronize cows to get those cows to come in and calve in a shorter window so that they're more similar when we go to market them and have a similar group when we sell them off. But that doesn't come free, right? There's cost of MGA, there's cost of cedars, etc. But that's a decision that we make. We have an opportunity. Can you all hear me? If I don't need the mic, I'm not going to use it. Can you hear me all right? All right, then I'm going to continue on. Thank you, Jay. Nutrition is influenced by forages here. We are a forage-dominant enterprise in this state, right? Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas. Our cow-calf operations, our stocker operations are forage-based. And that provides a significant amount of the nutrition that those cattle are going to receive. So we do need to think a little bit. Most of us really like managing cattle and thinking about the cattle aspect, but we need to really pay more attention to the forage aspect on this. Okay, identify some of your strengths and weaknesses that you have within your production system. Many of you may have, for example, very productive soils. That's a strength. Perhaps you've got soils that you could do a little bit of tillage and maybe spread out some of those quote-unquote summer slump issues by incorporating other types of forages. Others of you may have strengths in the fact that I'm very good at identifying sick animals early, getting on top of those stocker calves early, and reducing my death loss from sickness. So identify those. Manage the forage as a crop, okay? Don't manage it just as a pasture. It is a crop that needs to be managed. Dr. Henning did a little follow-up for us over in eastern Kentucky where we were doing a red clover seeding. And the red clover just didn't take very well. And so he did a follow-up. We had some soil tests came back, and the fertility was really poor. All right? And so there's things that we need to think about before we do some of these investments. And it's an integrated approach from soil profile all the way up to the management of the livestock. Cattle are the harvesting equipment that are out there, right? They're harvesting the crop that you're focused on growing. If the crop isn't fitting the system, in this case perhaps Kentucky 31 that's infected with the wild type Endophyte is not fitting the system, we're not getting the breeding success that we want out of our animals, or we're having other issues that Dr. Roberts went through, maybe we need to think about changing the approach. And that's kind of where we want to have you think about. Is that forage component the weakness in the system? Or are there other factors involved? So, we know from the integrated resource management data, if you all remember back in the late 90s, early 2000, the SPAL data was looked at heavily in cow-calf operations. And the thing that came out of the SPAL data was that the #1 profit driver out of cow-calf operations were pounds of weaned calf per cow exposed. And so that is very different than just taking the total pounds that I wean off and sell, because many of us don't have 100% pregnancy rates, 100% calving rates, and then 100% weaning rates. We typically have some cows that are exposed to the bull for breeding that don't settle. We then maybe have some cows that lose a calf during gestation, and then we may have a calf that's stillborn, or we may lose a calf through the time that it's born till weaning. So we're not 100%. And so some of those cows get culled as opens or whatever, and we forget to account for the input costs that we had in those cows for maintaining them the period of time they were in the farm. And so here's an example. If I had a 535-pound average weaning weight, but yet I only had an 85% weaning rate success, in other words, 15% of the cows did not wean a calf, my adjusted weaning weight per cow exposed drops back down to 455 pounds. Okay, and that's the net production for the herd. All right, whereas the 535 pounds is the production for the cows that only weaned a calf. And so we forget about that. And that is a major profit driver. And we know from some of the research that we have some challenges in spring calving herds that are on the wild type infected Kentucky 31 fescue. This is a very complicated slide, but don't get all hung up in it. It just shows you the factors that are involved that can influence the pounds of calf weaned per cow exposed. And there are many of them, right? Management things that we can influence are several, but we've got females over here that lost calves. Perhaps our forage system is impacting that because it's causing vasoconstriction, increased core body temperatures in the summer, that's reducing conception rates. We also have average weaning weights, and we'll show some information here, but Dr. Roberts went through this already. Maybe we get better gains when we don't have that forage out there, we improve the forage. Milk production. We didn't really talk much about this, but one of the side effects is that we reduce prolactin, which is a hormone that is pro-lactation, right? And so if we reduce prolactin, perhaps milk production is not going to be up to the genetic merit of the cows in the herd and the heifers in the herd. So there are a lot of factors that come into play, and forages do tend to influence this system in many different areas. Now, we need to change our mindset, I think. The crop guys always talk about bushel yield per acre, right? They talk about how many bushels of corn per acre, bushels of bean per acre. We probably need to think about shifting our mindset about how many pounds of beef are we producing per acre, or what is our gain produced per acre. We need to probably think about that more like the crops guys to try and see. Land prices are going up or down? Up, right? And so as land prices go up, it gets to be more of a challenge trying to get that land to bring more into the system and that, and so maybe we're trying to think about how can I get more per acre, all right? Fixed costs then, your land investments and everything are going to be spread out over more pounds, so your fixed cost as part of your input cost begins to get diluted down because you're getting more pounds per acre. And that's a key thing to keep in the back of our mind. So the question is how can one achieve greater gain per acre? A lot of this is through technology. Whether it be fly control, whether it be the use of implants for stocker calves to get an extra 2 to 3/10 a pound of gain, whether it be a feed technology, or maybe this technology of having a novel endophyte fescue. We already went through a lot of this. We know it's a significant amount of financial burden to the industry. I'm not going to go through this. Dr. Roberts went through that already. So we need a holistic approach. And so what we're going to try and go through is one of the things that we need is the data. We need data to make decisions. And so here is some data on stocker cattle average daily gains. And this is a lot of the data that's out there right now. And you can see that as we look at the research that has been peer-reviewed and published, the average daily gain response was anywhere from 4/10 up to as high as about 1.2 pounds additional gain per day on stocker calves when we look at grazing a novel fescue versus Kentucky 31 infected with the wild type. If we adjust this on a gain per acre basis, it winds up being that we get about 2 pounds additional gain per grazing day when we adjust for stocking rate. That's pretty significant, okay? That's a big increase. And so if you think about it, 100 days of grazing on a pasture would get you about 200 pounds of additional gain per acre. And so that's a pretty significant improvement. What is the gain per acre on stocker calves, do you think? I got to find that perfect spot. You know, on fescue, it might be 400 to 500 pounds. Alfalfa, you know, I think, Chris, there was some work at Princeton that was up close to 1,000 pounds per acre. But we need to understand that a 200-pound bump is pretty significant improvement. Okay, we've got a little data. I asked Dr. Van Zant and Alex Altman, who's a PhD candidate with him. We've been grazing some of the novel fescue out at the Woodford farm for the past 3 years. And I just want to show you the data here that came from Woodford so that you understand maybe a little bit more regional type data. Anywhere from 2/10 of a pound to 3/10 of a pound bump in average daily gain. Now the one thing I will say is that our Kentucky 31 pastures are not pure Kentucky 31 anymore. The pastures have transitioned some. There's some bluegrass in there. There's some orchard grass in there. And so we're getting maybe a bit of a dilution effect here in those Kentucky 31 pastures. But if you've got highly infected pastures that are predominantly Kentucky 31, the response is going to be greater than that. Cow-calf, Dr. Roberts went through this already. There's only a couple published studies out there, but you can see the response in pregnancy rates can be as high as an additional 36%. But you need to have these kind of numbers to use in a sensitivity analysis on the economic aspect. On the fall calving herds, we still begin to see a response, but it's about half the response of what you would expect to see in a spring calving herd. They're not dealing with the heat stress that we are in June, July breeding. And so that response isn't quite as big, but the response is still there. Now, we get questions about bulls because bulls can be impacted as well. There's not a whole lot of data out there on bulls. There's 3 published trials out there. But you can see that average daily gain is reduced on developing bulls, anywhere from 1/2 pound up to about 1 1/4 pound a day. Sperm motility is reduced anywhere from 20 to 70% when they're out on infected fescue. And then abnormal sperm is almost 2-fold higher when they're on Kentucky 31. So we know that the endophyte is causing vasoconstriction as well to the scrotum that influences temperature regulation and normal sperm development. And so perhaps that is a factor leading into some of our pregnancy rate issues, right? And so that might be it may not just be the cow, guys. We may have to take some of the blame and put it on the males, okay? So there is the potential here to see some improvements in fertility on the bulls if we move over. This is some work from Dr. Coffey's lab looking at what happens if we just replace 25% versus 100% replacement in spring calving herds versus a fall calving herd if we went no replacement versus just 25 replacement. So in other words, we're going to take 100 acres and we're going to convert 25 acres into novel fescue and not the whole farm. And you can see here on these spring herds, if you look at the average partial net return per acre, there's a significant financial improvement in these spring calving herds, $60-some per acre, of just investing in 25%, or basically 25 out of 100 acres. And so you don't have to think about this as a whole farm conversion. Take a little bit at a time. Now, the question is, how many years does it take to pay this off? A lot of us have gotten together over the last year to try and look at this in a little bit more complete system. There's a joint effort from several states. Dr. Roberts, Joe Horner from Missouri kind of led the effort. Craig got Matt Poore on the line. John Andre was on the line. Nick, you were on the line. So a lot of us put some ideas and things in to develop a spreadsheet decision tool to more accurately reflect how long does it take to pay off renovation. And so when I run the numbers that are pretty typical for us, typically you can get this down to about 3 years. Worst case scenario, it might be up to 5 years. All right? So it doesn't take a long time, given the data that we have on the average daily gain and the cow impacts, to pay for the renovation. This is just a snapshot of the tool. I kind of ran a worst case scenario here. We normally wouldn't do this, but what we learn in reality is that sometimes our fescue pastures aren't managed, right? And you should be applying fertility to keep soil fertility up. But what if you haven't and you're going to renovate and now you got to apply fertility? I built that in here. We probably shouldn't do that because that should be a normal cost, but I put that in here. I took out longer period of time for grazing during establishment than what we probably really need. And so worst case scenario, I was down here about 5.8 years. I think that's worst case scenario. All right, these stands are going to last a long time. It's Kentucky, it's tall fescue. It's not Kentucky 31, but it's the same basic germplasm as Kentucky 31. If well managed, they will last a long time. And so within 3 to 5 years, you're going to have this paid for, and then the potential additional gain per acre, calorie production per acre is going to be increasing your profits for the next 20, 25 years potentially. Okay? So any questions, thoughts, discussions? So this decision tool is very complex, but we've tried to build everything in there to make it flexible that we can do some sensitivity analysis. Good question. Where are my forage specialists?
That's a common question, and there'd be more discussion today. We'll talk about this more, but the quick answer is not if your stand doesn't thin or you don't bring in your neighbor's hay. Bringing in infected hay, with the seed heads on it, that's the quickest way to reinfect it. But just year after year with no change in the pasture, no stand thinning, you're not going to have a problem. If the stand thins, having old Kentucky 31 in there is the least of your problems. You'll have all kinds of things in there.
Craig, would it make sense for people, if they're producing their own hay, to start with their hay fields? Put their hay fields in all Endophyte?
Some people do that. We have producers who do that. The thing about it is when you cut hay, just within about 3 weeks, half of those toxins are gone. It's still toxic. Hay is still toxic. But hay is one of the easiest forages to control toxins. So there's some pros and cons to that.
From the animal perspective, I would say we would be better off to do our grazing pastures to try and give the animals some reprieve in the summer heat to try and reduce that impact on the animal.
Yeah, because what the Arkansas study showed, and everybody's quoting it, it's pretty accurate, and it's just 25% to start with. Use that during the breeding season. That's really critical to get that regrowth back where it should be. That'd be where I would start.
And Dr. Klotz, I can't remember on some of your all's work with the time that it takes to kind of clear the system, 6, 8 weeks? 5 to 7? So if you think about vasoconstriction, that's going to be that longest lasting, and that's one of the things contributing to heat stress in the cattle. We probably want those pastures available to graze earlier than what you might think. Because if they're going to get a heavy dose like Dr. Roberts showed when the seed heads are up, we don't want them to get a slug dose, say the the third week in May, and then it takes them 4 to 6 weeks to clear that, we probably want to be maybe even getting on those pastures the third week in April, first week in May, to avoid that heavy slug so that when heat stress does occur, we don't have those issues and having it taken so long to get back out. I'm saying if you think about Kentucky 31 and the potential endophyte levels, and as they increase as that seed head comes up, and we know that they will pick seed heads and eat them, they get a very big dose based on what Dr. Roberts' data showed you, and then that level, it takes a long time for the animal to clear them, and so we need to be thinking about getting animals out on non-Kentucky 31 earlier. Because if you're turning the bulls in the breed on May the 15th, they're getting a pretty heavy dose of the endophyte alkaloids, the ergot alkaloids, May the 15th through June 1. And then that's going to carry for 4 to 6 weeks before we get them cleared out of the body, which is nearly your whole breeding season. Right?
Effect. Say I've consumed all these alkaloids, what's the residual effect? Well, what do you measure it? I mean, if you're doing like Randy Dinkins or Jimmy Kloss, if you're looking at vasoconstriction, it can be several weeks. But if you're looking at core body temperature or intake, they can snap back pretty quickly. Glenn Atkin did that work right here in Kentucky. So it depends on the symptom. If you're looking at fescue foot and the hoofs come off, that's very long lasting. And hair coat is very long.
That's right. Good points. So I didn't spend a lot of time going through the model, but let me just say this. When I ran that kind of worst case scenario, well, let me go back. The pasture renovation and establishment costs were just a little over $200 an acre. And that came in nearly spot on of what Dr. Burdine presented back about 9 years ago at KCA Forage Conference. And so I bring that up because we're using custom rates from this past year, current prices on fertility, current prices on seed, etc. And I guess I'm trying to say that over the last 9 or 10 years, that price hasn't really changed in establishment. So that's not an excuse that it's gone up so much, I guess is the way I would put that. So time-wise, how are we on? I tried to blow through that kind of quick to make sure we had plenty of time, but the tool is there, and we've got it where we can really tweak things a lot to give your own inputs in. You know, if the custom rate of spraying is $7 and yours is more like $10, that tool allows us to build that in at $10, and so we can give you a better idea of what that might cost. Any questions, other questions? Well, not yet, but Dr. Robertson was just mentioning that after these meetings and we go through and make sure it works for everybody's kind of scenarios, we'll probably wind up publishing that here within the next 6 months or so.